What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. I took time out of videos, and I'm really considering cutting down on the videos. May not do any more videos. I may do one more, two more. I'm concentrating on a book that I'm writing that is very important to me. I'm reading other books, right? Why shouldn't I have one myself? But I want to get it right. And this book is going to be about the opportunities that black fighters had and didn't have, the contributions they would make, how boxing would change under black fighters' contributions. And I thought that would be a great place to start. That means a lot to me because I did a video on black fighters not getting the just due that they so rightly deserve. And it's very important that we recognize that because black fighters played a major contribution in the game of pugilism, going way back. And a lot of that will be in the book, so you'll have to wait when the book comes out to find a lot of that personal information in detail. But the game would change officially, really, in 1920 under the Walker Law. Now, in the book will be the venues that great black fighters would fight in, the gymnasiums that they would train in, the laws that would pass through the generations of boxing. And those laws would begin to help black fighters get the recognition and opportunities that they would so rightly deserve. So they deserve mentioning. Rules and regulations that would change because of boxing, the 3 knockdown rule, the padding that would be applied to the poles in the ring. So many different laws and rules that would change, black fighters would be a part of. But 1920 is what would help change the game under that Walker Law. September 1st, 1920. Now, the main event that Tex Rickard Promotions would stage that would begin under the new Madison Square Garden, under this Walker Law, would take place September 17th, 1920. And the main event would be Johnny Dundee, who was known as the Scotch Wop, and Joe Willing. It was 135 pounds. Fight took place at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was scheduled for 15 rounds. And the referee was Bill Brown. And I go through all this because it's very important that we understand how all these things got started. Now, Joe Humphreys was the announcer. Preliminaries, you had Joe Benjamin and Pete Harley. Now, Joe Benjamin, and I'll go through him in the book as well, very good Jewish fighter. But then you would have Jack Dempsey. That would be the first heavyweight championship contest under Tex Rickard's promotion at a New York Madison Square Garden in 1920 under that Walker Law. And it would be Jack Dempsey and Bill Brennan. And that was another very important fight that would take place under that Walker Law. December 14th, 1920. New York's Madison Square Garden. Jack Dempsey would knock out Bill Brennan in 12 rounds. And that would be the first World Heavyweight Championship contest under Tex Rickard's promotion in the New York Madison Square Garden under the Walker Law. So as we go through these in my read of my book, we'll realize when black fighters really got opportunities. Young Peter Jackson would fight at the Garden, but he would not be a fighter who would start his professional debut as a black fighter. The first fighter to do that would be Ray Robinson when he fought a fighter by the name of Joe Escoveria. Ray Robinson professionally debuted October 4th, 1940. It was under a main event card with Henry Armstrong, who, by the way, would become the fourth black welterweight champion in boxing history, and he would be the third black fighter to become a champion in New York's Madison Square Garden. This happened in 1937 when he would defeat Petey Cerrone, and he would become the first black American featherweight champion, but most importantly, the third black fighter to win a title. Now, the first one under the Madison Square Garden, the first one would be Theodore Tiger Flowers. 1926, he would become the first black middleweight champion in boxing history. He would defeat Harry Greb, the Pittsburgh Windmill. The second black champion to fight in New York's Madison Square Garden would be John Henry Lewis. He would defeat Bob Olin. Now, Bob Olin would be a stockbroker in Wall Street. And when the stock market crashed and it put everybody out of business in 1929, Bob Olin would begin to box. And he would become a champion. But he would lose his title in 1935 in New York's Madison Square Garden under John Henry Lewis, who would become the second black champion in any weight division. And the third one would be Henry Armstrong in 1937 when he would defeat Petey Cerrone, and he would become not only the first black American featherweight champion, but he would become the third black fighter to win a title. So all these things matter, and all this information would be in the book. But the thing is, the Madison Square Garden is such an iconic building, and it would do an injustice if I don't mention a lot of very important stats from that building. Now, we talked about the laws. The Hawthorne Law was the first law. It was governed by boxing in New York's Madison Square Garden, New York State, November 1896 to August 30th, 1900. And it went out of existence because Charles Kid McCoy would take on James J. Corbett. And what happened in that fight was that the Hawthorne Law was permitted fights to be conducted in New York State without any limits of rounds. And that would change. That would have to change, because now you're trying to legalize the sport. And so 15 rounds would then be what was considered the norm. Also, the problem with the Hawthorne Law is it didn't take account of the revenues that were produced by the fights. Taxes were not being paid. You know that was not going to last. Wasn't governed properly. And so the Lewis Law would then take over, but that didn't last much longer. Then on August of that year, there would be some more changes that would take place. But from 1900 to 1911, boxing was staged in New York on club membership basis only. And that would bring back the Frawley Law, boxing in New York State in 1911, and permitted boxing without decisions and limits to them with 10 rounds, with a boxing commissioner in charge. So on February 5th, 1918, the People versus Packy O'Gady, anti-boxing law, violations and sanctioned 1710 Penal Code, anti-boxing law, violations upheld by the Supreme Court. And Justice Peter A. Hickoritz, with the rule of membership, boxing in New York. This is when they began to take a look at the Walker Law. When it went into effect May 24th, 1920. And they would suggest 15 rounds. Now, they got a lot of these rules and regulations under the AEF, America's Expeditionary Forces. And that was a military sanctioned sporting iconic venues where boxing was a part of. Gene Tunney, who was the America's Expeditionary Forces light heavyweight champion in 1919, and just share one more thing with you. The reason why Gene Tunney was not as popular as he was, and he should have been, because he was a military veteran, fought for the services of the United States of America. And he was a war hero. But the reason why he wasn't as popular as Jack Dempsey, because although Gene Tunney would win the light heavyweight championship in 1919 under the AEF, it's because Jack Dempsey would become the heavyweight champion of the world in Toledo, Ohio, knocking out Jess Willard in the fashion in which he did. And there were so many controversial articles that came out that it overshadowed Gene Tunney. So when they fought in 1926 and 1927, it somewhat became personal with Gene Tunney because Jack Dempsey, as they consider him to be a draft dodger, was overshadowing a military war hero in Gene Tunney. And Gene Tunney took that personal. So there's a lot of great stories in boxing, but I wanted to touch on the opportunities that black fighters didn't have, opportunities they had, what creations came out of fights that black fighters would participate in, what new laws would come about under black fighters, such as Emil Griffith and Betty Kipperett in 1962, such as a man by the name of Eugene Hairston. You know, at one time they were calling him Dummy Eugene Hairston because he couldn't hear and he couldn't speak. So they would change a couple of rules in New York's Madison Square Garden. The red blinking light, last 10 seconds, was because of Eugene Hairston. And that red blinking light in the last 10 seconds could have saved Meldrick Taylor and Julio Cesar Chavez in 1990, March 17. Referee Richard Steele panicked and didn't take his job as serious for the fighter as he should, in my opinion. He didn't give Meldrick Taylor a standing 8 count, which is one of the rules that would change, and we'll go through all that in my book. He gave him a 9 count. Meldrick Taylor was up at the count of 6. He waved it off at the count of 9. 2 seconds left. 2 minutes and 58 seconds. Julio Cesar Chavez would have never thrown another punch. 22 square foot ring. It takes 18 steps to get across. We have 2 seconds left. It would have been 1 second if Meldrick Taylor was given a full 10 count. Then you ask the man, give you his gloves, maybe take a step forward, fight's over. So it's because of these rules. It's supposed to give opportunities for fighters. So the Walker Law was where they went with, and then, of course, obviously you would have other things that would change throughout the course of boxing. The Muhammad Ali Act, couldn't be a promoter and a manager in the same ring. But boxing has really became a war zone, really, because it doesn't have a national commissioner. And when you have promoters who come and pretty much change the rules based on the fight that was fought before that last fight, you're going to have the kind of problems you have. Now, World Title fights, one in New York's Madison Square Garden, in the second building. By the way, the second building, the first building was from 1897, and the second building, well, the 1897 to 1890, and the second building was from 1890 to 1925. And in the year 1925 is when you would really begin to have some great fights. But December 22nd, 1920, bantamweight champion Joe Lynch would win a unanimous decision in 15 rounds, and he would defeat Pete Herman. And he would become a bantamweight champion of the world. September 23rd, 1921, bantamweights Johnny Buff, the winner in a 15-round unanimous decision over Pete Herman. November 18th, 1921, the junior lightweight Johnny Dundee, Scotch Wop, would win on a foul in 5 rounds over George Chaney. September 21st, 1922, 122 pounds, Jackie Kid Wolf would win a 15-round unanimous decision over Joe Lynch. Mickey Walker would take on Jack Britton in 15 rounds, November 1st, 1922. By the way, I list those great fights that took place in 1922. My opinion, 1922 and 1951 were two of the most dramatic years. In all of boxing. So I have a section of dramatic years in boxing that will be coming out in that book. But 1922, you would have George Compartier lose his light heavyweight championship title to the first black light heavyweight champion. He was from Africa, and his name was Battling Siki. And it was controversial, but Battling Siki would defeat George Compartier. George Compartier would be the only fighter who would win a title in each weight division. And he was a very interesting individual. At the age of 16, he was a referee for Jack Johnson and Frank Moran. He was a very unique fighter, was George Compartier. But he would lose his title in 1922 to Battling Siki. Battling Siki would also be the year that Sam Langford would knock out a future first black middleweight champion, and his name was Theodore Tiger Flowers. 22 would also be the year that the Ghetto Wizard, Benny Leonard, who was a lightweight champion of the world, could have been a welterweight champion had he not hit Jack Britton, boxing marvel, who at that time was the welterweight champion of the world. He would have 20 amazing contests with Teddy Kid Lewis, who Ted Kid Lewis was the first fighter to test out gum shields, or mouth guard, if you will. Well, Benny Leonard hit Jack Britton while he was down. He became disqualified and lose opportunities of becoming a welterweight champion of the world. Also that year, in fact, read the book. So March 20th, 1925, at the second New York's Madison Square Garden, for the bantamweight, you would have Charlie Phil Rosenberg. He will win on a 15-round unanimous decision over Eddie Cannonball Martin. I talk about that. I talk about Eddie Cannonball Martin and Abe Goldstein. Abe Goldstein was a substitute for Johnny Buff. He was supposed to be in that ring, and he got the opportunities. Now, the third guard, February 26, 1926, would be Theodore Tiger Flowers' opportunity, and he would defeat Harry Greb in 15 rounds for the middleweight championship crown. Now, he would take on Harry Greb 3 times. Harry Greb, I salute because he would give Tiger Flowers an opportunity at his title. Now, I talk about all this in my book. How in the United States, it was not a law for black fighters not to get an opportunity. It was a racist fraternity, if you will. England, it was. And I talk about that as well. I mentioned names like the Harlem Thunderbolt, Harry Smith, Pride of Harlem, Julius Williams. His name was Jack McVeigh. Talk about George Godfrey. He was a colored heavyweight champion. Now you had two who was colored heavyweight champions. You had a fighter by the name of Old Chocolate, who would lose his title to Peter Jackson, 19 rounds. He was stopped. And then you had the Leaperville Shadow from Mobile, Alabama, George Godfrey. He would take on Obie Walker. Obie Walker would take on some great challenges during his day, particularly Elmer Valiant Ray 14 times. I talk about the amount of times that fighters fought each other, black fighters fought each other. 1927 was a very interesting year. Fidel Barber would win a unanimous decision in 12 rounds over Elkie Clark. Tommy Loughran, the Philly Phantom, would win 15 rounds over Mike McTeague. And that fight took place October 7th, 1927. Izzy Schwartz. His name was Corporal Izzy Schwartz. Very good fighter. He was a flyweight. He would win 15 rounds over Newsboy Brown, who, by the way, I talk about a fighter by the name of Elaudio Valdez. His name was Black Bill. And he was blackballed, no point intended. No point intended. Newsboy Brown. You had Midget Wargast. Andre Rogers. You had a lot of good fighters. You had, definitely. But Black Bill, because the New York SAC didn't recognize a 19-year-old to fight for a championship, you couldn't fight past 6 rounds. Black Bill didn't get that shot. So many things happened where black fighters were just, unfortunately, stigmatized. Yeah, Kid Chocolate, January 13th, 1933. I'm sorry, October 13th, 1932. He would defeat Lou Feldman, 12-round technical knockout. That was a very important fight. Tony Canzanelli, who won a 15-round unanimous decision over Lou Ambers, May 10th, 1935, for the World Lightweight Championship title. Francisco Escobar would be the first Puerto Rican fighter, November 15th, 1935. Bantamweight champion. He would defeat Lou Salica. Lou Salica would go back and forth with a black fighter. And you'll read that in my book as well. But that would be very interesting. But Lou Salica was on a 1932 Los Angeles Games Olympic team. He would bring home a silver medal. Harry Wiley Sr., who was not in the Boxing Hall of Fame as a trainer, had helped guide that team before he was fired by Landers. And the man who was on that team was Lou Salica. Now, Henry Armstrong tried out for the team. The Medley Jackson. He came up short, but he would have a better professional career than he had as an amateur. Henry Armstrong, since we're talking about him, I mentioned he would defeat Peter Cerrone. October 29, 1937, in New York's Madison Square Garden, he would become the first Black American featherweight champion and the third as a featherweight, to make that clear, and the third black fighter to fight in New York's Madison Square Garden. And so there are so many important things to look at. Henry Armstrong would lose his welterweight championship title October 4th, 1940 against Fisticuffs in New York's Madison Square Garden. But it was a baton that was passed to the new up-and-coming star, and that would be Ray Robinson, who would be on that undercard. It's a very interesting night. A little more than a year later, Ray Robinson would defeat Fisticuffs for his idol, Henry Armstrong. And he said he learned more by facing Fisticuffs than he did by any other fighter. Now, between the second and the third building of Madison Square Garden, 1925 to 1968 is when you would have fights in the third building. But between 1925, second and third building, you would have fights. And December 11th of 1925, that's when Tex Rickard would take over the promotion in New York's Madison Square Garden in the third building. And he would promote Paul Berlenbach, who was known as the Historian, Queen's Astoria Assassin. He would defeat Mike Mateague for that title. Well, he would take on Jack Delaney. And you had 16,973 members in the audience. They grossed $148,155. And that would help make the case for Tex Rickard that the fights should remain in Madison Square Garden, because there were talks about taking boxing out of the Garden. December 18th, 1925, Phil Kaplan would take on Babe Herman in front of 14,081 spectators, and they would gross $54,705 for their fights. Now, all this is at the top of the head, so you have to excuse me. December 23rd, 1925, Theodore Tiger Flowers would take on Mike Mateague, and it would be in front of 13,777 spectators, and it would gross $49,976. $49,976. And that would total up to $252,836, if my math is correct, in 1925. Well, why I'm going through all this is because after hundreds of fights that took place in Madison Square Garden, and you had 30 fights in 1928, you had about close to that in 1927. You had a little more than 28 or so fights in 1926. But guess what? You heard me talk about Henry Armstrong being the first to do something. He was the first Black American featherweight champion. He was the third black fighter to fight in New York's Madison Square Garden. But in 1937, when he defeated Petey Cerrone to become the first Black American featherweight champion, and he would become the third black fighter to win a title fighting Petey Cerrone, New York's Madison Square Garden. Well, he would be the first main event fighter, world championship contest, to fight under the promotion of Mike Jacobs. That was Mike Jacobs' first promotion in New York's Madison Square Garden, and it happened on the night of October 29th, 1937. And the attendance was 11,847 spectators, and they grossed $34,708, the most of that year. Henry Armstrong did that. So there's a lot of things that we really need to appreciate. 1940, Henry Armstrong, January 24th, would take on Pedro Martinez. 19,157 spectators together paid $59,575. I want you to take a look at what I'm saying here. These years that I'm mentioning to you were depression years. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what I'm going to be doing moving forward and what I'm working on. It's taking some time because I want to get it right. I want to bring out some very important key points. 1971, March 8th to be exact, the 5th Madison Square Garden. You would have, it would be the 4th Madison Square Garden. And you would have Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali. That was a World Heavyweight Championship contest. Both undefeated fighters, both recognized as World Heavyweight Champions. And they would have a collision course. May 24th, 68, you would have Bob Foster, who would knock out Dick Tiger in 4 rounds with a vicious left hook. Took place in New York's Madison Square Garden. When you go up to October 19th, 1984, Mike McCallum, he would become a junior middleweight champion for the WBA, defeating Sean Manning, 15 rounds. And a lot of these fights from the late 70s moving forward, I was at all those fights in Madison Square Garden. So I share my experience with you. Chalky Wright would take on Willie Pep November 20th, 1942, New York's Madison Square Garden. Willie Pep would defeat Chalky Wright. Chalky Wright was a very good fighter, and he would become a champion. But Willie Pep would defeat him. So, thanks for listening. I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. All great fights, all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. And that's what's happening with me. And when the book does come out, it's going to be amazing. Bo Jack and Bob Montgomery, November 19th, 1943. They fought again March 3rd, 1944. And they packed the house. Ray Robinson would become the 5th black welterweight champion in boxing history in New York's Madison Square Garden, December 20th of 1946, when he would defeat a fighter by the name of Tommy Bell of Ohio. I thank you for listening. Peace.